In the geopolitical nightmares of the 1970s, the end of the world didn't start with a button. It started with a sound. It was the rumble of 40,000 diesel engines echoing through the valleys of West Germany. This was the Fulda Gap scenario, the doomsday prophecy that kept NATO commanders awake at night. Intelligence reports were clear: if the Cold War turned hot, the Soviet Union would not play games. They would launch a steel tsunami. Divisions of T-62 and T-72 tanks, supported by endless waves of BMP infantry carriers, would flood through the lowlands of Hesse, aiming straight for Frankfurt. The NATO defenders were skilled, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every American tank, there were 3 Soviet tanks waiting to crush it. The mathematics of attrition were terrifying. The West realized with a cold dread that they could not stop the Red Army on the ground. They needed a miracle from the sky. They needed an executioner capable of destroying armor on an industrial scale. But the United States Air Force didn't have an executioner. They had Ferraris. The generals in the Pentagon were obsessed with the age of speed. They were building the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon, sleek supersonic thoroughbreds designed to dogfight at 30,000 feet. They looked down on the concept of close air support. They called it mud moving. To fly low and slow digging tanks out of the dirt was considered unglamorous and suicidal. Soviet air defense doctrine was the densest in the world. Their ZSU-23-4 Shilkas and SA-6 missiles were designed to swat low-flying aircraft like flies. The Air Force establishment believed that any plane slow enough to kill a tank was slow enough to die. However, a small group of rebel engineers and strategists known as the Fighter Mafia disagreed. They looked at the Soviet tank armada and realized that speed didn't matter if you couldn't hit the target. They argued that America didn't need another delicate racehorse. It needed a Warthog. They proposed a radical, ugly solution that baffled the Air Force brass and made the Soviet observers laugh. They decided to stop trying to fit a gun onto a plane. Instead, they would build the most powerful gun in history and then wrap a plane around it. The result was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a machine so ungainly, so utilitarian, and so undeniably ugly that the pilots refused to call it by its official name. They simply called it the Warthog, to understand why the Soviets eventually learned to fear this machine more than anything else in the US. Arsenal, you have to start with the heart of the beast, the GAU-8 Avenger. This is not a machine gun. It is not a cannon. It is a piece of artillery that happens to fly. It is a hydraulically driven 7-barrel Gatling gun that is larger than a Volkswagen Beetle. The entire weapon system weighs 4,000 pounds, nearly 20% of the aircraft's total weight. When the gun was placed on the floor of the factory and the engineers tried to design the airframe around it, they realized the gun was so big that the front landing gear had to be offset to the side just to make room for the barrel. The statistics of the GAU-8 are terrifying. It fires 30mm rounds. These are not bullets. They are milk bottles made of metal. But the secret wasn't just the size. It was the composition. To penetrate the composite armor of modern Soviet tanks, lead and steel were insufficient. American scientists developed a projectile with a core of depleted uranium. This is a byproduct of nuclear enrichment, a metal that is 1.7 times denser than lead and pyrophoric. This means that when a depleted uranium slug slams into the side of a T-72 at 3,500 feet per second, it doesn't just punch a hole. The kinetic energy turns the metal into a superheated spray of molten lava that self-ignites. It acts like a plasma torch, burning through the tank's armor and incinerating the crew, the fuel, and the ammunition inside. The gun fires at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. That is 65 rounds per second. The recoil force generated by the GAU-8 is 10,000 pounds of thrust, slightly more than the thrust of one of the A-10's engines. Physics dictates that if the pilot fired the gun continuously, the recoil would actually stop the plane in midair. But the most iconic aspect of this weapon is not the damage, it is the sound. Because the bullets travel at hypersonic speeds, they hit the target before the sound of the gun arrives. A Soviet tanker would see his comrade's tank disintegrate in a flash of sparks, and only seconds later would he hear the noise. It was a low, guttural, vibrating roar that sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart, a sound often described as canvas ripping violently. Insert GAU-8 sound effect here. It became the death rattle of the Soviet Armored Corps. When the first pictures of the A-10 reached Moscow, the Soviet generals were unimpressed. In fact, they laughed. Soviet doctrine emphasized speed and altitude. They looked at the A-10's straight wings, its bulbous nose and its strange engines mounted high on the tail, and they saw a relic. It looked like something from World War II. It had a top speed of only 400 miles per hour, subsonic, painfully slow. Soviet intelligence analysts labeled it a sitting duck. They believed that their radar-guided anti-aircraft guns would tear it to pieces before it could even get within range. They arrogantly assumed that the Americans had made a mistake building a cheap, low-tech toy in an era of high-tech missiles. But the Soviet arrogance blinded them to the genius of American survival engineering. The A-10 designers knew it would be hit. They accepted it. So they designed the first aircraft in history built specifically to survive direct hits from armor-piercing explosive shells. They created the titanium bathtub. The pilot sits inside a tub of titanium armor that weighs 100-200 pounds and ranges from 0.5 to 1.5 inches thick. It is tested to withstand direct hits from the Soviet 23mm cannons, carried by the ZSU-23 Shilka. The canopy is bulletproof. The cockpit is a fortress. Every critical system on the A-10 is double or triple redundant. The fuel tanks are self-sealing and filled with reticulated foam to prevent explosions. They are buried deep inside the fuselage, not in the wings, to protect them from ground fire. The hydraulic flight control systems are duplicated. And if all the hydraulics are shot away, a scenario that would cause an F-16 to plummet like a stone, the A-10 has a manual reversion mode. The pilot can physically fly the massive jet, using steel cables and pulleys cranking the heavy controls with pure muscle power, just like a biplane pilot from 1917. The engines, the General Electric TF-34s, were placed high on the rear fuselage for a specific tactical reason that baffled the Soviets initially. By placing them between the twin tail fins, the exhaust was shielded from the ground. This masked the plane's infrared signature, making it incredibly difficult for Soviet shoulder-fired heat-seeking missiles like the SA-7 Strela to lock on. And even if a missile did hit, the engines were mounted on pylons away from the fuselage. If an engine exploded, it would simply fall off, leaving the tail and the wing intact. The A-10 could fly, fight, and land with one engine, one tail fin, and half a wing missing. It was a zombie. It refused to die. The skepticism about the Warthog wasn't limited to the Russians. The U.S. Air Force leadership hated it. They tried to cancel the program multiple times. They wanted to spend the budget on more F-15s. They argued that in a modern war, a slow plane was a dead plane. The A-10 pilots were mocked by their fighter jock colleagues. They were the mud hens flying the ugly plane that nobody wanted. But the A-10 pilots had a quiet confidence. They practiced low-level flying, skimming the treetops at 50 feet, popping up only for seconds to unleash the gun before vanishing back into the terrain. They knew something the generals didn't. They knew that on the battlefield, beauty doesn't kill tanks. Physics does. The test came in 1991. Operation Desert Storm. The Iraqi army was the fourth largest in the world, equipped, trained, and entrenched according to Soviet doctrine. They had thousands of T-72s and T-62s. They had the integrated air defense network that Moscow claimed was impenetrable. When the ground war began, the fast movers F-16s and F-15s stayed high, dropping bombs from altitude. But the A-10s went down into the dirt. The Iraqi tankers, confident in their heavy frontal armor, suddenly found themselves in a horror movie. They would see a dark, cross-shaped shadow flicker over the sand dunes. Then came the dust kicks of the 30mm shells impacting the ground, walking toward them at incredible speed. Then the turret of the tank next to them would erupt. The depleted uranium rounds punched through the top armor of the T-72s, the thinnest part of the tank, turning the interior into an inferno. The psychological effect was devastating. Iraqi prisoners of war later confessed that the A-10 was the single most terrifying weapon of the war. They called it the Cross of Death. They learned that when a jet screamed over at Mach 1, it was usually gone before it dropped a bomb. But the A-10 didn't leave. It had a massive loiter time. It would circle overhead like a vulture, hour after hour, picking off targets one by one. The sound of the GAU-8 became a trigger for panic. Entire Iraqi tank crews abandoned their pristine vehicles and ran into the desert rather than face the Warthog. One incident cemented the legend. An A-10, piloted by Captain Paul Johnson, was hit by a Soviet-made shoulder-fired missile. The explosion blew off the entire right wingtip and destroyed the hydraulic system. The plane rolled violently. In any other aircraft, this was a fatal hit. Johnson prepared to eject, but then he remembered the manual reversion. He disengaged the hydraulics and grabbed the stick. It was heavy, fighting him like a wild animal. But the cables held. The titanium bathtub held. Johnson flew the crippled, smoking wreck hundreds of miles back to base and landed it manually. When the ground crews saw the damage, they were stunned. The plane shouldn't have been flying. It defied aerodynamics. The Soviet military observers watching the destruction of their client state's army were horrified. They realized they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had focused on shooting down high-tech fighters, but they had no answer for a low-tech brawler that could take a punch to the face and keep coming. The A-10 wasn't just killing their tanks. It was killing their military philosophy. The ugly duckling had proven that in the rock-paper-scissors of war, a giant flying gun beats a tank every single time. As the smoke cleared over the highway of death, revealing miles of twisted, burning Soviet metal, the laughter of the critics died out forever. The A-10 Warthog had earned its place in the pantheon of legends. It proved that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the most brutal one. The Americans hadn't built a plane. They had built a flying tank capable of unleashing the end of the world 30 millimeters at a time. And for the Soviet tankers who faced it, the last thing they ever heard was the sound of freedom clearing its throat. To understand the true horror of the A-10 Warthog from the perspective of a Soviet or Iraqi tanker, you have to look beyond the plane and look at the bullet. The Soviet Union spent decades developing composite armor and explosive reactive armor (ERA) for their T-72 and T-80 tanks. These technologies were designed to stop heat-seeking missiles and high-explosive anti-tank rounds. They were brilliant feats of chemical engineering, but the A-10 didn't play by those rules. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon didn't fire explosives, it fired physics. Specifically, it fired the PGU-14B armor-piercing incendiary round. Inside the aluminum casing of each 30mm shell was a penetrator rod made of depleted uranium Du. Depleted uranium is a nightmare metal for tank designers. It is incredibly dense, so dense that a small rod of it carries the kinetic energy of a freight train when moving at Mach 3. But its most terrifying property is something called adiabatic shearing. When a normal tungsten bullet hits armor, it mushrooms, it flattens out, losing its penetrating power. When a depleted uranium bullet hits armor, it self-sharpens. As it burrows through the steel of a T-72, the sides of the uranium rod shear off, keeping the point razor-sharp until it punches all the way through. And once it enters the tank, the friction creates so much heat that the uranium dust spontaneously ignites. It creates a firestorm inside the turret that burns at 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew isn't just killed by shrapnel, they are vaporized by a pyrophoric cloud. During Desert Storm, Soviet military advisors watching the battles were horrified to see their invincible tanks not just exploding, but burning with an intensity they had never seen before. They realized that the A-10 was bypassing their armor technology entirely. It didn't matter how many reactive tiles a T-72 had on its turret. The GAU-8 would strip them off in the first half-second of a burst, and the remaining rounds would gut the vehicle. The Warthog wasn't fighting the tank, it was erasing it. The Soviet Union had its own version of a ground attack aircraft, the Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoot. On paper, the Frogfoot was a formidable machine. It was faster than the A-10 and arguably more agile. But the comparison reveals the fundamental difference in philosophy between the two superpowers. The Su-25 was built like a conventional fighter jet that carried bombs. Its gun was a 30mm cannon, yes, but it carried only 250 rounds of ammunition. The pilot had to be stingy. He had to aim carefully. The A-10, by contrast, carried 1,174 rounds of ammunition in a drum the size of a cement mixer. An A-10 pilot didn't have to be stingy. He could saturate a target area. He could walk his fire onto a column of tanks and hold the trigger down until everything stopped moving. The A-10 was built for sustained violence. The Su-25 was built for a quick strike. Furthermore, the survivability of the A-10 baffled the Soviet engineers. The Su-25 was tough, but the A-10 was practically immortal. The engines of the A-10 were high-bypass turbofans which are quiet and run cool, making them hard for infrared missiles to lock onto. But more importantly, they were mounted in separate pods outside the fuselage. If a missile hit one engine, the explosion occurred away from the main body of the plane. The shrapnel wouldn't sever the tail or kill the pilot. The A-10 could lose an entire engine, half its tail, and huge chunks of its wing and still fly home. There are photos from Desert Storm of A-10s landing with battle damage that would have disintegrated any Soviet aircraft. This durability had a profound psychological effect. Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners would shoot at an A-10, see pieces fly off, and cheer thinking they had killed it. Then the plane would turn around, leveling its nose at them, and the Brrrrt would begin. They realized that you couldn't just hurt the Warthog. You had to completely destroy it, or it would come back for revenge. The pinnacle of the A-10's career and the moment that cemented its legend while breaking the spirit of the Soviet-equipped Iraqi army was the Highway of Death. In the final hours of the war, thousands of Iraqi vehicles, tanks, and stolen civilian cars were attempting to flee Kuwait City on Highway 80. It was a chaotic retreat. The A-10s arrived in waves. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. The pilots didn't even need to use their sophisticated Maverick missiles. They simply lined up on the highway and fired the gun. The GAU-8 tore through trucks, armored personnel carriers, and T-72s indiscriminately. The road became a miles-long corridor of burning wreckage. For the Soviet generals watching the satellite imagery and news reports, the Highway of Death was a professional trauma. They saw the charred skeletons of their best equipment, the T-72s, the BMP-2s, the ZSU-23-4s stacked up like firewood. They realized that in the face of absolute air superiority and a dedicated tank killer like the A-10, their doctrine of massed armor was suicide. If they had tried to invade the Fulda Gap in Europe, this is what would have happened to them. The A-10s would have turned the German countryside into a graveyard of Soviet steel. The ugly plane had proven that it was the ultimate counter to the Red Army's strategy. But the A-10 wasn't just a brute. It was smart. While the gun gets all the glory, the AGM-65 Maverick missile made the Warthog a sniper. The A-10 could carry up to 6 of these heavy television-guided or infrared-guided missiles. A pilot could spot a tank from 6 miles away, well outside the range of Soviet anti-aircraft guns, lock on and fire. The phrase rifle would be called over the radio. The missile would streak away, and seconds later, a turret would fly into the air. This standoff capability meant that the A-10 could dismantle the dangerous air defense units, first peeling open the enemy formation like an onion before moving in close to use the gun on the defenseless survivors. The Soviet air defense network, Kari, which they claimed was impenetrable, was dismantled piece by a slow, ugly plane that refused to play fair. Another aspect that shocked the observers was the A-10's ability to operate from austere locations. The Soviets relied on well-maintained air bases. The A-10 was designed to operate from a dirt road or a grassy field. It has low-pressure tires and a rugged suspension. It can be refueled and rearmed by a small team of mechanics in the middle of nowhere, with the engines still running. This meant that the A-10s could keep up with the front lines, providing constant cover for the Abrams tanks. It was a weapon of relentless pressure. There was no respite for the enemy. If the tanks stopped to rest, the Warthogs were there. If they moved, the Warthogs were there. The psychological stress caused by the constant presence of the A-10 led to mass surrenders. Iraqi tankers would park their perfectly functional vehicles and walk into the desert, preferring to face thirst and capture rather than spend another minute inside a target for the GAU-8. There is a story of an Iraqi battalion commander who surrendered to a drone. When interrogated, he said that during the Iran-Iraq War, they would fire at Iranian planes and the planes would go away. But with the Americans, specifically the A-10 shooting at it, just made it angry. He described the sound of the gun as the voice of death. This psychological dominance is a force multiplier that cannot be measured on a spec sheet. The Soviets could build tanks with thicker armor or bigger guns, but they couldn't build morale that could withstand the sound of the Avenger cannon. Even the A-10's own side was sometimes terrified of it. The blue-on-blue incident's friendly fire were the dark side of its immense power. Because the A-10 operated so close to the friendly troops, misidentifications happened. The sheer destructive power of the 30mm gun meant that mistakes were often fatal. However, this also highlighted the trust the infantry placed in the plane. Despite the risks, every time a U.S. Marine or soldier was pinned down by enemy fire, the first thing they screamed for on the radio was air. And when they saw the distinct silhouette of the Warthog dipping a wing overhead, they knew they were going to live. The A-10 became the guardian angel of the ground troops. By the end of the Gulf War, the statistics were staggering. The A-10 fleet had destroyed over 900 tanks, 2,000 other military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces. It had flown over 8,000 sorties, and despite being the most shot-at aircraft in the war, flying low and slow, in the teeth of the enemy defenses, only 5 A-10s were shot down. This survival rate was mathematically impossible according to pre-war estimates. The Soviet models had predicted that A-10s would be falling from the sky in droves. They were wrong. The titanium bathtub, the redundant systems, and the sheer toughness of the airframe had proven that American engineering was superior to Soviet ballistics. The Soviet Union dissolved in late 1991, just months after witnessing the annihilation of its proxy army in Iraq. While economic and political factors were the main cause, the military humiliation in the desert played a role. It shattered the myth of Soviet conventional superiority. It showed the world that a warehouse full of T-72s was worthless if you couldn't control the sky above them. The A-10 Warthog, the plane the Air Force wanted to cancel, the plane the critics called ugly, had flown straight into the heart of the Soviet military doctrine and torn it apart, leaving nothing but burning metal and a terrifying sound echoing in history. After the carnage of the Highway of Death in 1991, one might assume that the A-10 Warthog's place in history was secure. The ugly duckling had proven itself to be a swan of destruction. It had decimated the Soviet-equipped Iraqi army. It had saved countless American lives. But back in Washington, the war over the A-10 was far from over. The United States Air Force leadership still hated the plane. They were embarrassed by it. To the generals who grew up worshipping speed and altitude, the A-10 was an anomaly, a slow, dirty, low-tech relic that didn't fit into their vision of a space-age Air Force. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, they tried repeatedly to retire the Warthog. They argued that it was too vulnerable to modern Russian surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. They claimed that multi-role fighters like the F-16 or the new trillion-dollar F-35 Lightning II could do the job of close air support just as well. They were wrong. And it took another war and another generation of pilots facing death to prove just how wrong they were. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, the A-10 was called upon again. This time, the enemy wasn't just sitting in the desert. They were embedded in the dense urban sprawl of Baghdad. The mission profile changed. The A-10s had to fly lower, slower, and closer to the threats than ever before. It was here over the skies of Baghdad on April 7, 2003, that the A-10 cemented its legend not as a killer, but as a survivor. Captain Kim Campbell, call sign Killer Chick, was flying a close air support mission over downtown Baghdad. The Republican Guard was putting up a fierce resistance, pinning down American ground troops. Campbell dived her A-10 into the teeth of the enemy air defenses to deliver a rocket attack. As she pulled off the target, a loud explosion rocked her aircraft. She had been hit by a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile. The damage was catastrophic. The explosion shredded the tail section. It severed both hydraulic systems instantly. The plane rolled violently to the left, pointing its nose at the ground. In an F-16 or a Soviet Su-25, this is a death sentence. Without hydraulics, a modern jet is a lawn dart. The pilot must eject or die. But the A-10 is not a modern jet. It is a flying tank. Campbell realized she had lost all control. The warning panel was lit up like a Christmas tree. But she remembered her training. She flipped a switch that no other jet in the U.S. inventory has: manual reversion. This disconnected the dead hydraulic sticks and engaged a system of steel cables and pulleys connected directly to the flight control surfaces. Suddenly, Campbell wasn't flying by computer. She was flying by muscle. She had to physically wrestle the stick to move the ailerons and elevators against the force of the wind. It was like trying to steer a semi-truck with no power steering while driving 300 miles per hour. The plane responded. It leveled out. Campbell looked at her wingman, who inspected the damage. The tail was riddled with hundreds of holes. The horizontal stabilizer was half gone. The engine cowling was smashed. Yet the General Electric engines were still turning, and the titanium bathtub had protected her from the shrapnel. For an hour, she flew the crippled beast back to base in Kuwait. Landing in manual mode is terrifying. You have no brakes, no steering, and very little control authority. But she put it down on the runway. When she climbed out and looked at her plane, she was stunned. It was a wreck. But it had brought her home. This incident became the ultimate counter-argument to the Air Force generals. A stealthy F-35 might not have been seen by the radar, but if it had been hit, it would have disintegrated. The A-10 was built on the philosophy that stealth is great, but armor is better. This philosophy resonated deeply with the ground troops. The infantry didn't care about radar cross-sections. They cared about the noise. When a Marine is pinned down in a mud hut in Afghanistan, taking fire from all sides, the high-pitched whine of an F-16 at 20,000 feet doesn't comfort him. He can't see it. But when an A-10 comes in at treetop level, the roar of the engines and the ripping sound of the GAU-8 tells him, "You are not alone. The cavalry is here." The psychological bond between the A-10 and the ground troops is unique in warfare. Because they fly so low and slow, A-10 pilots can see the battlefield with their own eyes. They can use binoculars. They can distinguish between a good guy and a bad guy by the uniform. This situational awareness allows them to drop ordnance danger close, sometimes within 50 meters of friendly troops, with a precision that high-altitude bombers cannot match. In Afghanistan, the Taliban learned to fear the Warthog just as the Iraqis had. They called it the Dragon. They knew that if they heard the jet, they had to stop shooting and hide. The mere presence of an A-10 overhead could suppress an entire valley of insurgents without firing a shot. However, the debate about the future of the A-10 rages on. The Air Force argues that in a war with a near-peer adversary like China or modern Russia, the A-10 would not survive. They point to the advanced S-400 missile systems that can shoot down aircraft from hundreds of miles away. They say the A-10 is a dinosaur waiting for extinction. They want to replace it with the F-35 Lightning II, but critics and the soldiers on the ground argue that this is a dangerous fallacy. The F-35 is a technological marvel, yes. It is invisible to radar. It is a flying supercomputer, but it is delicate. It carries only 180 rounds of ammunition for its internal gun, enough for a 2-second burst. The A-10 carries 174 rounds. The F-35 cannot fly slow enough to escort a helicopter or loiter over a convoy for hours. It consumes fuel at a prodigious rate. Replacing a sledgehammer with a scalpel is fine if you are doing surgery, but sometimes war is just demolition work. And for demolition, you need the sledgehammer. The legacy of the A-10 Warthog is also a final crushing verdict on the Soviet doctrine of armored warfare. The Soviet Union spent the entire Cold War building the largest tank army in history. They believed that quantity had a quality all its own. They believed that 50,000 tanks could overrun Europe. The existence of the A-10 rendered that entire investment obsolete. What is the point of building 50,000 tanks if the enemy has a plane that can destroy them at a rate of 10 per sortie for a fraction of the cost? The A-10 proved that countermeasure technology, the plane can be cheaper and more effective than the threat technology, the tank. Today, the A-10 is still flying. Congress, pressured by Army generals and veterans who owe their lives to the Warthog, has repeatedly blocked the Air Force from retiring it. It has been upgraded with new wings, digital cockpits, and helmet-mounted sights. It is now a smart hog. It can drop laser-guided bombs with the same precision as an F-16, but it still retains the brute force of the GAU-8. There is a poetic irony in the A-10's survival. It was the unwanted child. It was the ugly plane designed to fight a specific war in Germany that never happened. Yet it has fought in every major American conflict since 1991. It outlived the Soviet Union. It outlived the Cold War. It outlived the F-117 Nighthawk. It will likely outlive the early models of the F-35. It survives because it works. It survives because it is simple. It survives because in a world of overcomplicated trillion-dollar technology that often fails, the A-10 is a machine you can trust. As we look at the modern battlefields of Ukraine, where tanks are once again grinding through the mud, the specter of the A-10 looms large. Military analysts often speculate, what would happen if Ukraine had a squadron of A-10s? The answer is terrifying for any Russian tanker. The columns of T-72s and T-90s, often stuck in traffic jams, would be nothing more than a buffet for the GAU-8. The Russian air defenses would be a threat, yes, but the A-10 was built to take that threat. It was built to eat Sams for breakfast and ask for seconds. The story of the A-10 Warthog is a reminder that war is visceral. It is loud, dirty, and violent. While technocrats dream of push-button warfare, fought from air-conditioned rooms with drones and stealth fighters, the reality on the ground is often mud and blood. And as long as there are American soldiers in the mud, they will want the ugly plane in the sky. They don't want a Ferrari. They want the Warthog. They want the sound of the end of the world directed at their enemies. The Cold War produced many monsters, but the A-10 is the only one we learned to love. It is a flying testament to American engineering, built to last, built to kill, and built to bring the pilot home. If you want to see more stories about the machines that defined an era and the secrets that kept the world from ending, make sure you are subscribed. From the bottom of the ocean to the sound barrier, we are uncovering the truth. Don't miss the next briefing. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the plane that was too ugly to be loved, but too good to die.